Now it's time to set up our greeter object. And this will be a bit tricky because we want to set it up the way that jQuery is set up. We're going to imitate jQuery's structure. What I want to do is set up my greeter so that it generates an object. So it'll be a function that generates an object. But what I'd like to do is whenever I use greeter, I'd like to just say $, and then pass first name, last name, and maybe language. And that's it. And what it gives me back is an object, kind of like jQuery does. So I don't want to have to say new all the time. So let's do that now. How can I set up a function that does this? Let's get started. We'll set up a function, a first name, a last name, and a language. And now I want it, instead of being a function constructor, so I have to use new, I want it to return the results of a different function constructor. Maybe like a .init, just like jQuery did. You want to try that yourself? Try to see if you can create a separate function constructor, greeter.init, that takes the same first name, last name, and language. And then have this function right here, this greeter function, return a new object created with that other function constructor. Go back and look at the jQuery if you want to again. Think about it a bit. At least give it a try. All right, ready? Return new something. Well, I'm going to need a greeter, and I'm going to do a property on my greeter. It's going to take the same thing. So it's return new. So I'm going to return and then use a function constructor to generate the object. That way I don't have to always set up the object with the new keyword. Then I'll do greeter.init, and this is the actual function. And notice that it's okay that I'm setting this up after this, because this won't be called until I actually use greeter. So by the time this is actually called, this will all be set up, all this other code will be already run. All right, so I'm going to set up some default properties. Do you want to try that? Set up some default values for first name, last name, and language. How would you do that? If I pass in first name, I want to use the first name I pass in. But if I don't, I want to set a default. And I want to add first name, last name, and language to this empty object that's created by new. So I need to use this. Give it a thought. How can I set up my new object? Because that's what I'm doing. I'm doing a function constructor, so I'm building an object. I'm building this new object that's going to be returned by the greeter function. All right, well, I'm going to use my nice self just to be safe. Self is the same as this, so that I don't have to worry about what this variable points to later. And I'll build my object, because this, and now self, points to the empty object created by the new operator. And I passed in first name, so I'll use or, and then I'll default to an empty string. And I'll build my object again, the new property, and one more. What should be our default language? Let's say English, EN for English. All right, so that's it. I have a function constructor that builds an object and gives it 3 properties and sets its value if you pass something into the function constructor, otherwise set some defaults. Now what about the prototype? Well, I want to use greeter.prototype because it looks nicer in my code. And that's just going to be an empty object for now. And here is where I'll put any methods that I want to use inside my object that's returned from greeter. But in order to do that, that means that this object here that's created needs to point to this as its prototype. Remember how jQuery did that? Well, any object returned from this function constructor will point where for its prototype. Where will an object created from this function, which is greeter.init, where will an object created from here, where will its prototype, its proto property be pointing at? Remember, those names are a little confusing. Greeter.init.prototype. This is a function. Any object created with this function as a function constructor, that's where the proto property is pointing. So all my objects are going to point here. If I call my greeter when it's ready, and this returns an object, then it'll return an object by calling this function constructor. So the .prototype property of this function is where that new object will point as its proto. Remember all that? Go back and look at that if you need to again. It can be a little confusing just because it's called prototype, but it really is just where objects that are being created are pointing at. And I want this to be the prototype of all objects created from this. So what jQuery did was this. Remember? It just says any objects created with this function should actually point here for its prototype chain. Got it? So now I can cleanly put my properties and methods on here, and it just looks a little better. All right, now I want to expose my greeter to the outside world. I want to attach it to my global object so that I can call this function on anywhere because it's sitting on the global object. We're not going to worry about checking to see whether it exists or not, okay? We're just going to attach it to the global object. And oh, we also want that nice alias, $, so I don't have to type greeter all the time when I'm using this. How do we do that? How do we add it to the global object? Try it yourself, and then alias it with $. How do we do that? Well, to make something available everywhere, I need to attach it to the global object. I passed it into this function that's being invoked, so it's called global because I passed in window. And I don't want my code inside of here to think about whether it's window or not, so we're just going to call it global. And maybe someday I could enhance this call to check whether window or not exists. All right, so global.greeter, because the global is what I passed into this function. And I also want an alias, global.$. And I'm going to set that equal to what? I'm exposing the greeter function. So it's just greeter. This greeter right here, which is a function. So on the global object, these two names will point to this value. Got it? So I have the basic setup of my object and my prototype. So if I go to my app, I can already say var, let's just say G equals $, John Doe. And I'm not going to pass a language. And let's console.log G. And let's refresh. Hey, look. I have an object with first name John, last name Doe, default language, and it's of type greeter.init, which makes sense because just like jQuery, I'm returning a new greeter.init. But its prototype is pointing here, so I can add my other methods and properties right here. Got that? We're well on our way. Let's add some functionality.